All right, welcome to our final study strategy, Chem 151, which is just managing test anxiety. So what we know is that anxiety or worry during a test impairs our grades. That's pretty obvious and clear. We have lots of evidence for it that test anxiety or worry relates to worse exam scores. So when we map out this structural map of how these different factors influence exams, we see that one's prior SAT score has a positive relationship with exam grades, but test anxiety has a very large negative relationship to exam grades. So the more anxiety we feel during that test, the worse our exam grades are. This is even when we control for a lot of other stuff like procrastination and prior knowledge and emotion and so forth. Another example of this, we had two groups that are learning the same information. Then on the second day, we give one group an acute stressor, and the other group doesn't get a stressor. And what we see is that the stressed group remembers significantly less of what they learned, or they're less able to retrieve that information after they have experienced that stress. So that stress or anxiety or worry at the time of retrieval can really get in the way of our ability to access that information that we have stored. All right, so why does stress affect our exam grades then? We have a lot of good evidence about what stress does to our thinking. And so these studies show that when we solve new problems under stress, that stress shifts how we approach the problems. It shifts which parts of the brain we're able to use and access. So we use less of our prefrontal cortex and less of our hippocampus, but more of the caudate and striatum. So again, these brain scans show that when we are solving problems under stress, we are more activating the very central areas of our brain rather than the prefrontal cortex area of our brain. So what that means is instead of being able to guide what we're thinking about, guide our attention, use flexible prior knowledge, inhibit inappropriate actions, which is what the prefrontal cortex could do. Instead, stress strengthens the influence of the amygdala on our thought patterns, and the amygdala drives us to habitual responses, to emotional responses, and so forth. In other words, instead of using cognitive stuff, stress shifts us to use more habitual responses, shifts memory towards an increased use of the striatal habit-like memory at the expense of the more flexible prefrontal cortex or hippocampal memory. So stress is really affecting how we are approaching problems and how our brain is able to respond to those problems. And we can even go further and see what's happening at an individual neuronal level, where when we are under stress, dopamine and adrenaline are more present. And so the dopamine and noradrenaline come into those neurons and they produce the cyclic AMP that opens up the HCN channels and produce the H current, which weakens the input and disconnects the prefrontal cortex. So that's suppressing our prefrontal cortex networks. In other words, these stress neurotransmitters are really affecting which areas of the brain we are able to rely on and use when solving problems. And they shift away from flexible use to more habitual use. So how can we manage this test anxiety so that we don't become affected by it, so it doesn't impair our exam performance? There's a few different ways. One of the main ways is through breathing techniques. A very common one is 4-7-8 breathing, where you breathe in your nose for 4 seconds, you hold a breath for 7 seconds, and you breathe out of your mouth for 8 seconds. Then you repeat the cycle 4 to 8 times. This downregulates your body's tension, arousal, and anxiety, and reduces that impact on you significantly. So these breathing exercises are really important for managing or reducing the test anxiety. Breathing exercise is the first one. Second idea to manage test anxiety is really to use practice test questions quite a bit. The more we are using practice test questions, the less anxiety we will feel during the actual test. So that will also reduce our test anxiety. And the last idea that's gaining a lot more traction and evidence is just that how we view that arousal matters. If we view the arousal during a test as exciting, useful, engaging, and helpful, it's actually going to help our performance and not hurt it. So if we can reinterpret how we're seeing that arousal, it can actually be a beneficial thing. So these are just some ideas about how we can manage our test anxiety so that it doesn't significantly impair our exam performance.